"Leave now," guards told a black veteran. Seconds later, SEALs arrived and silenced the room. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. When two security guards tried to escort a black Marine out of his son's graduation, no one expected 6 Navy SEALs to rise from the crowd and stop the entire room without saying a word. Solomon Dritton didn't expect anyone to recognize him when he pulled into the parking lot behind Elmage High School. The building looked like most small-town Texas high schools. Weathered red brick, a few flags flying over the entrance, kids milling around the gym doors. It was already crowded, parents in shirt sleeves, siblings holding signs, a grandmother leaning on a walker. It was business as usual. He parked his Dodge Charger against the chain-link fence and walked out, smoothing the creases in his navy blue Navy uniform. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, not because he was trying to show off, but because there were some things he couldn't do halfway. He glanced around. His posture was conspicuous, straight and firm. His face, though calm, had the equanimity of a man who had seen life from too many sides. He had driven 8 hours from Temple to attend his son's graduation. He could have flown, but the Charger had been his wife's favorite car, and even after her death 2 years ago, he still felt closer to her on the road. Solomon opened the car door and pulled a small photograph out of the glove compartment. It was old and worn, with a small tear in the corner. His wife holding Tyrone when he was a baby. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I promised you," he said quietly, "I wouldn't miss this." The walk to the entrance was slow and deliberate. Every step carried meaning. His chest was filled with some emotion he couldn't name, but it lived somewhere between pride and pain. Inside, the gym was packed. Metal chairs filled the floor, the bleachers already overflowing. The air smelled faintly of concession stand popcorn and floor wax. It was loud, chaotic, alive. Solomon showed his printed ticket to the volunteer at the door, a short man with a clipboard and a headset. The man glanced at him, nodded quickly, and pointed to the third row on the left. "All right, family seats up front." "Thank you," Solomon said, his voice calm. He headed toward the row, catching glances from other families as he went. A few people glanced at him, exchanged glances when they saw the uniform, and then looked away as if they hadn't noticed. One woman gave him a weak smile, then whispered something to the man next to her. Solomon didn't react. He had been black and tall and in uniform for a long time. He knew what some of the looks meant and what they didn't. He found his seat and sat down. The chair was plastic, a little wobbly. He adjusted it without complaint. The stage was set in front of him. Banners hung across the wall of the gym. Class of 2024 in big silver letters. Several student council members stood near the podium, checking notes. Solomon glanced at the rows of students lined up at the far end of the gym. Tyrone was somewhere in the middle, tall and long-legged, with his mother's eyes. 18 years had passed like this. He remembered holding him in his arms the night he was born, still in uniform, dirt under his fingernails. He had flown in from Okinawa with only 4 days of leave, and now they were here. He sat still, barely blinking, savoring the moment. Behind him, people continued to file in. Chairs scraped, programs rustled. Someone laughed too loudly. A man dropped his coffee and muttered under his breath. None of it affected Solomon. His world narrowed to the stage, the rows of young faces, the weight of the photograph on his chest. Then the music began. Pomp and circumstance, and the crowd rose to its feet. Some of the students looked nervous, others beamed. Solomon stood too, his shoulders squared, his hands at his sides. The national anthem that followed. Everyone placed their hands on their hearts. Solomon didn't move. He didn't have to. His entire presence was a salute. He thought again of his wife, how she would have cried throughout the ceremony, how she would have adjusted Tyrone's tie 3 times before sending him out of the house. His gaze remained ahead, but as the last note of the anthem faded, 2 men in uniform began walking down the side aisle, and they were heading straight for him. The 2 security guards moved with purpose. They weren't cops. Their badges read, Harlan Security Services, and their uniforms were standard issue. Black polo shirts tucked into cargo pants, headsets, radios on their belts. Neither looked a day over 30. One was short and broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and an intense expression. The other was taller, long-legged, and chewing gum, like he had a better seat. Solomon noticed them immediately, but he didn't flinch. His training had taught him long ago that stillness was often more powerful than movement. He kept his eyes ahead, his hands loosely on his hips. The short guard stopped next to him, leaning down just enough to be heard. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a low voice. "We need you to come with us." Solomon turned his head slowly. "Is there a problem?" The tall one stepped forward. "Yes, this section is for alumni families." Solomon blinked, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the same printed ticket he'd shown at the door. "This is my seat. Third row, left side. Family seating. Confirmed." The short guard didn't even look at the ticket. "We were told it was taken." Solomon didn't move. "He was busy when I got on, too. You want to tell me who gave that order?" The tall guard shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He hadn't expected the calm, clear voice. "Look, it's no big deal. There are a few extra seats in the back. Let's not make a big deal out of it." Solomon's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in quiet calculation. "I drove 8 hours to watch my son walk across this stage. I'll be sitting right here." A few heads started to turn. A woman in the second row nudged her husband and nodded in their direction. Someone in the stands tilted their phone slightly, perhaps recording. The shorter guard straightened and looked back. "Sir, let me ask again." "You can ask all day," Solomon said, his voice lower, firmer. "I'm not moving." The tall man clicked his teeth. "You might be more comfortable in the back. That's all we're saying." And there it was. Solomon was looking at him fully now. The phrase wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about politics. It was about something older, something quieter, something that had haunted him his entire life, in boardrooms and waiting rooms and porches, and even in the base cafeteria, just beyond the smile, just beneath the whisper. He didn't answer. The air around them shifted, the way it does when people begin to sense a line has been crossed. The shorter guard noticed it too. He adjusted the radio on his hip and muttered into the microphone, his eyes still locked. Solomon remained seated, looking ahead as if the conversation were over, because for him it was. The woman next to him, older and fair-skinned, leaned toward him slightly and whispered, "Don't let them move you." He nodded once, acknowledging her, but saying nothing. He didn't want to make a scene. He wanted to watch his son graduate like any other father, but the guards weren't finished. The tall one lowered his voice again. "Look, you have a problem? Take it to the school office. We've got our orders." Solomon turned his head toward him again. "Do you have a name, son?" The guard blinked. "This is Officer Molly." "Not an officer," Solomon replied. "You're private security." The other one cut in. "Okay, that's enough. If you don't get up—" He didn't finish his sentence because at that moment the door to the gym at the far end clicked open and 6 men walked in. No uniforms, no badges, just a firm posture, squared shoulders, and faces that said they'd been through worse than awkward glances and misdirections. They didn't walk in together. They walked in one by one, taking different places, as if they weren't together. But anyone watching closely could tell. They moved the same way, looked at the room the same way, sat the same way, still calm and wary. Solomon didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly who they were, but the guards didn't, at least not yet, and they were about to find out. Solomon focused on the stage. His jaw didn't move, but his mind was working. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside him had snapped into place, like a switch he didn't use unless he had to. One that was built for survival, for balance, for patience under pressure. The 2 guards didn't leave. They were floating. It was the kind of floating that wasn't about doing a job. It was about trying to remind someone that they had power. But what they didn't understand was that Solomon lived in places where power was a matter of life and death, not some gym with folding chairs and a sound system. A student's name was called on stage, and the crowd applauded politely. But people weren't really paying attention to the ceremony anymore, at least not those who were nearby. They were watching the standoff, pretending not to. The tall guard, Maley, shifted his stance again. He leaned closer, his voice lower. "I'm trying to do you a favor. Okay, this shouldn't get unpleasant." Solomon glanced at him. "You don't have a favor to offer." A pause. Maley pulled back slightly, as if reconsidering his next move. But the shorter one, Garvin, according to his badge, was less subtle. He didn't like being challenged. His hand hovered over his radio again. A few rows behind, a man stood up slowly. No one noticed at first. He said nothing, just crossed his arms and stared. Clean-shaven, broad frame, sharp eyes. He sat down near the aisle, his eyes never leaving the scene in front of him. A second man stood up from the opposite side of the gym. The same pose, calm, purposeful. Then a third. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Solomon knew them all. He didn't turn around because his instincts didn't require confirmation. He'd led these men through mud and machine gun fire, and silence darker than most people could imagine. Garvin leaned in again. This time there was something new in his voice. "Listen, man, you're making a problem of this." Solomon turned his head slowly, deliberately, "And you're not listening." Garvin's hand jerked toward the radio again, but before he could say anything, a voice tensely interrupted the tension, coming from 10 feet away. "Is there a reason this man is being disturbed?" The voice was clear, calm, controlled, the kind of voice that doesn't rise to attract attention. He lowered his voice enough to silence the others. The voice belonged to a tall man standing in the center aisle, with a gray beard and a fitted black coat over a gray shirt. His name was Creed Man. He was the man Solomon had pulled from the rubble at Kandahar, dragging him across 200 yards of sand through a hail of bullets. Garvin looked up, taken aback. "Who are you?" Creed didn't answer. He stepped forward. "I asked you a question." Malay raised his hand. "Sir, we're in control." "No," Creed said more sharply. "You're not." Another man rose from the far bleachers, then another. There were 4 now. Solomon remained seated, still silent. The entire left side of the gym was now openly watching. The boy pointed. The teacher tried to draw attention back to the stage, but no one was looking at the diplomas anymore. Creed took another step forward. "You're embarrassing yourselves, and you're a hair's breadth away from making things worse." Garvin glanced at Maley, who was looking less and less confident with each passing second. It was clear now. They weren't expecting reinforcements, especially not that kind of reinforcements. "I don't care what your orders were," Creed said. "You don't touch that man. You don't tell him to move. You don't even ask again." The silence in the gym grew tense, the kind of silence that came not from fear, but from respect. A quiet respect that began to build as more people realized what was happening. Solomon finally looked up at Creed and nodded almost imperceptibly. Not a thank you, not a request, just an acknowledgement. Creed's eyes softened for a moment, then he stepped back and sat again, crossing his arms. But the tension was still in the air. Not yet, and the watching men waited to see what the guards would do next. The gym went dark. The stage, the banners, the faces, all blurred in the back of Solomon's mind. His eyes were still open, but the memory jerked him back. 15 years ago, Afghanistan. It was late evening in Kandahar province. The sun didn't set gently there. It fell like a hammer, turning sand to rust, in the air to steel. Solomon, then a gunnery sergeant, had just finished briefing his unit when everything went wrong. An IED on the side of the road exploded beneath their convoy, flipping the lead Humvee over like a toy. Dirt and metal rained down before anyone could scream. Then the gunfire started. Not random, but coordinated. Solomon didn't think. He acted. He ducked behind what was left of a doorframe, surveying the chaos. Smoke billowed across the edge of the valley, but he saw 6 wounded men trapped behind the burning wreckage of the second vehicle. Most were pinned down. One was already trying to crawl forward, dragging another by the vest. It was Creed masked. He'd only been in the country 3 months and had taken a bullet to the thigh. Solomon ran, without hesitation, without calling on his radio. He ran across the open ground, dodging gunfire, ducking for cover behind a broken axle. Creed looked up, blood on his temple, gasping for breath. "You're bleeding," Solomon said. "Have you noticed?" Creed cleared his throat. Solomon grabbed the straps of the fallen soldier next to him, Enrique Stowe, and began to tug. Creed pushed from behind, wincing with each attempt to move. "Where's Divas?" Solomon called. Creed pointed weakly. "On the left, under the hood." Then Solomon saw him, a young SEAL, pinned under part of an engine block, his leg trapped. He was calling for help, but he was too badly hurt to move. Without stopping, Solomon told Creed, "Stay low and move when I move." Creed nodded. Then he really began to understand what leadership looked like. Solomon broke into a run again. His foot hit gravel, then bone, but he didn't stop. He crawled to Diva's, crouched, and grabbed the edge of the mangled hood with both hands. He didn't move. "Gunny, don't," Divas called. "I'm okay. I'm okay. You're not staying here." Solomon dug his foot in, dug in and lifted. His shoulders were tense, his ribs aching. The metal groaned, but rose enough for Divas to wrench his leg free. They fell together, crawling toward the ridge. Shots cracked overhead. Creed came back with Stowe, limping on his good leg. The other two followed, Lim and Horton, their faces blackened with ash, rifles raised. When the shooting stopped, there was no cheering, no victory speech, just silence and breathing. All 6 of them were alive. Solomon was the last to check. He stayed on rear guard until the dust settled and the medevac arrived. For a long time after that, he said nothing. But Creed remembered. Everyone remembered. After that day, no one doubted anything. If Solomon asked for anything, anywhere, anytime, they would be there, no matter what. Back in the gym, Creed sat quietly in his chair, his eyes fixed on the guard still standing next to Solomon. He wasn't thinking about the war. He was thinking about promises. The man who had gotten him out of a war zone was now being chased in front of a high school stage for trying to watch his son graduate. He clenched his fists. Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, walked in and sat 4 rows back. Then Zachary Wells found a seat in the right field bleachers. They didn't talk. They didn't have to. Solomon glanced briefly toward the back of the gym. His gaze met Mix's. That was enough. But the guards didn't understand what those looks meant. Not yet. And the moment they took the next step, they would understand very quickly. The ceremony continued, at least on the surface. Names were still being called. Families clapped, some too loudly, trying to drown out the tension that was now thick in the air. But the attention had shifted. Eyes that had once been fixed on the stage now wandered constantly to the 3rd row from the left, where Solomon Dritton sat like a statue, and 2 guards stood as if they didn't know what to do next. Garvin glanced forward, where a school official was trying to get his attention. The woman looked nervous, whispering and gesturing toward the guards, but Garvin shook his head. He wasn't ready to leave. He'd started something, and his ego didn't know how to back down. Millie shifted his weight again, his jaw working harder on his gum now, clearly uncomfortable. But he didn't leave either. "Sir," Garvin said again, louder this time, "this is your final warning." Solomon didn't move. "Do what?" Garvin stepped forward, leaning so close his belt brushed Solomon's knee. "Stop making a scene. We don't want any trouble. Just step back." Solomon turned his head and looked him straight in the eye. "You're the one causing trouble." Garvin's nostrils flared. That's when it came out. "You think the uniform makes you better than everyone else? This is high school, man, not your base." Silence fell around them. The little girl stopped fidgeting in her seat. The father with the camera froze mid-approach. Even Molly took a half step back, as if the words had hit harder than he expected. Solomon didn't blink. He sighed, not to calm himself, but to stay grounded. "You need to leave." Garvin didn't leave. Instead, his hand dropped to the front of his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to feel threatened. And then Creed stood. He didn't shout. He didn't strut. He simply stepped into the aisle, slow and focused, as if talking was his business now. The gym wasn't dead silent, but it was close. Creed's voice was clear. "If you touch him, you'll answer to me." Garvin turned his head. "Who the hell are you?" Creed took another step forward. "The man who tells you it ends right now." One of the school board members noticed what was happening and whispered something to the principal. The vice principal stood up and started moving toward the back of the gym, probably calling someone on the radio attached to her side. The school staff finally realized that this wasn't going to go away quietly. More SEALs rose from their seats, spreading out across the room. No formation, no verbal commands, just a single instinct that kicked in at once. By now, all 6 of them were standing. Garvin glanced around, realizing that they weren't just dealing with some angry parent. Something was different. These people weren't fidgeting. They weren't shifting from foot to foot. Their presence filled the space like pressure before a storm. Creed took a step closer. You have two options. Leave now, or watch this escalate into something you don't want. Mali's voice finally broke through. Let's just back off, man. But Garvin still hesitated. Solomon spoke again, not to Garvin, but to Creed. Don't waste your breath. He had already made up his mind. Creed didn't smile. He simply lowered his voice one last time. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Finally, Garvin backed up. Not much, but enough. His hand dropped from his belt, his face burning, but he was outnumbered and outplayed. The director appeared at the door, whispering quickly to the guards. Whatever she said, it was quiet, but firm enough to send them both heading for the back exit. They didn't look at anyone along the way. Solomon exhaled, slow and steady. Creed sat back down without saying anything. All 6 SEALs remained standing, but the moment was still in the air, and Tyrone Dritton watched from the line of students, his hands clasped at his sides. Tyrone Dritton stood near the center of the graduating class, between a girl with bright braids and a boy whose gown kept slipping off his shoulders. They were trying to focus on the ceremony, laughing nervously and checking their name cards, as if the world were normal. But Tyrone's world was not. Ever since the anthem ended, he had seen the 2 security guards walking toward his father. At first, he thought it was just routine. Maybe they were helping someone find a seat, but something in his chest told him otherwise. Then he saw the way his father sat, so calm, so composed, but frozen. He had seen that look before. The same look he caught when he was 12, and he came home crying because someone at school said something they shouldn't have said. His father hadn't raised his voice then either. He just sat there with the same expression on his face, like steel that refused to bend. Tyrone watched as best he could. From his place in the line, he couldn't hear what was being said, but his body language told him enough. He saw the guards standing too close, saw his father sitting quietly, and then he saw a man stand up, a tall man in a dark coat. And somehow Tyrone knew this wasn't just a parent. This man knew his father. The way he moved, the way he positioned himself between the guard and the man beside him, it was clear. He wasn't here for the drama. He was here for Solomon Dritton. Then another man stood up, and another. It wasn't loud, but it was like the temperature in the room had changed. Everyone was watching now. Taryn's heart was pounding. He wasn't afraid. He felt something else, torn between pride and anger. He'd grown up hearing isolated stories of his father's service, not the horrible parts. His father kept most of it to himself, but bits and pieces here and there. A friend who sent Christmas cards every year, a scar from somewhere in the dust, a box in the garage labeled Kandahar that no one had ever opened. He'd never known the names, never seen the faces, but now they were here, standing as if they'd been waiting for this moment, as if they'd never stopped watching his father's back. Tyrone blinked hard, fighting back the burning in his eyes. He didn't want to cry. Not here. Not now. The line moved forward. A few names were called. The applause slowly resumed, like someone had pressed play again after a pause. But the room was no longer the same. The energy had changed. It wasn't about balloons or banners anymore. It was about respect. One of the assistant principals tapped Tyrone on the shoulder and said something he didn't hear. He just nodded. The student next to him leaned over and whispered, "Is that your dad?" Tyrone didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The whole gym saw it, and now everyone in the building knew what kind of man Solomon Dritton was. In the audience, Creed remained standing. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't seek attention. He looked at Solomon, still sitting in the same plastic chair, hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the stage, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The other Marines were standing too, not strutting, just present. Their silence spoke louder than any microphone. Some of the parents were clapping louder now with each name, almost as if they were trying to make up for the tension that had built up earlier. The gym had become a living thing, stirred by a moment of injustice, held together by the weight of honor. Solomon remained still, not defiant, not bitter, just present. A father watching his son take another step into adulthood. But the moment that would break through all of this was yet to come. And when Tyrone's name was finally called, the room could pretend no more. The line moved faster now. Some of the students were still fidgeting, adjusting their caps, whispering jokes under their breath, trying to enjoy the moment. But Tyrone was no longer in that space. His thoughts kept returning to his father, sitting alone, surrounded by faces, but completely focused on that chair, as if it had been made just for him. There was something in the way he held himself, calm, quiet, unwavering, and something in the way these men, these warriors, stood around him without needing to be asked. Tyrone realized for the first time that he truly didn't know the full weight his father carried. Sure, he'd seen the photographs, the medals in an old wooden box, the folded flag tucked into a bookshelf in the living room, but those things never really spoke. They just sat there, like relics. Today they walked. Today they stood. The vice principal called out another name, then another. Tyrone was 3 people from the stage. He wiped his palms on his robe, tried to slow his breathing. The girl in front of him turned and smiled nervously. "Ready?" Tyrone smiled a little. "More than you think." He stepped forward. Across the gym, Solomon leaned forward slightly. His gaze never left the stage. He didn't applaud every student, not out of disrespect, but because his attention had narrowed to the boy in the black robe with the red and white ribbons of distinction. The boy who looked so much like his mother when he smiled. 1 name, 2 names. Then the announcer paused for a second, cleared her throat, and spoke with more weight than before. "Tyrone Dritton," the name echoed. There was a second of silence, half a second, maybe less, before the room erupted. Applause, whistles, shouts. But what stood out was not the volume. It was the rhythm. The sound was not chaotic. It was purposeful, coordinated, deep. The 6 Marines still standing raised their hands and applauded in perfect unison. Each clapped with force, not for show. A salute without a salute. A gesture that said, "We see you, we see your father, we honor both." Tyrone walked slowly across the stage, chin high, confident in his steps. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't nerves. It was pride. And not just pride in himself. It was pride in knowing who his father was and what it meant to carry that name. He took the diploma from the principal, shook her hand, and turned to the audience. His eyes searched for one person, found him. Solomon didn't wave, didn't stand. He simply met his son's gaze and gave him the smallest, most meaningful smile of the day. Tyrone nodded once and walked off the stage. The applause was still going strong. The parents, who had remained silent throughout the ceremony, were now clapping loudly. Some stood, some wiped their eyes, not exactly sure why, but sensing that they had just witnessed something important. Solomon sat back in his chair and let the moment wash over him. He wasn't the kind of man to cry in public, but inside something eased. Not grief, not pain, just relief. The kind that only comes when a circle seems complete, even if it isn't. More names kept coming, but from that moment on, something changed. Every student who walked across the stage walked in an echo of what had just happened. Not because it was dramatic, not because it had gone viral, but because it was real. But the story didn't end with applause. And when father and son met again outside the gym, it would be more than just a proud embrace. It would be the transmission of something deeper. The last name was called 20 minutes later. Everyone stood as the graduating class threw their caps, screamed in relief, and hugged each other as if they hadn't seen each other in years. Phones went up, cameras clicked, and balloons bobbed above the crowd as students began filing out the double doors of the gymnasium and into the backyard. Solomon didn't move right away. He sat quietly as the noise grew around him, taking it all in. The music, the laughter, the flashes of silver and red robes as they passed. His eyes followed Tyrone as he disappeared down the hall with his classmates. A teacher high-fived him. Another put an arm around his shoulder. But even in the chaos, Tyrone turned once, just once, and looked back. Solomon saw it. It was a brief glance, but it said it all. "Did you see me?" And the look on Solomon's face said, "Every second." The crowd began to thin. People were coming out with flowers and balloons, cheering loudly. Solomon stood up slowly, stretching his legs, feeling the weight of sitting in one position for so long. Creed approached as the gym emptied. He said nothing at first, just looked at Solomon, then at the exit. "Are you okay?" Creed finally asked. Solomon nodded. "I've been through worse." Creed smiled slightly. "Yeah, but it still shouldn't have happened." "No," Solomon said. "It shouldn't have happened." Another Marine, Javier Meeks, joined them. "We were trying to stay inconspicuous, but as soon as that guy put his hand on his belt," Solomon raised his hand gently. "You all did what needed to be done. That's enough." The three men stood there for a few moments longer, letting the noise fade from the room. Then Solomon said, "I want to see my son outside." The sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete, casting long shadows from the bleachers into the backyard. Students were scattered in small groups, posing for pictures, throwing their caps again, calling out to relatives. Tyrone stood near the flagpole, his gown half unbuttoned, his diploma folder in one hand, his phone in the other. He stopped mid-conversation when he saw his father approaching. The crowd around him faded into the background. They met halfway. Tyrone spoke first. "Are you okay?" Solomon nodded. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," Tyrone said, then looked down for a second. "They tried to move you." "I know." Tyrone's jaw tightened. "I was ready to walk off the stage, Dad. I swear I was 2 seconds before I said something." Solomon put his hand on his son's shoulder. "And that's why you didn't." Tyrone held his breath for a second. "What do you mean?" "Because you knew I could handle it. And because you were a man in that moment, you didn't let anyone take that away from you." Tyrone held his breath for a second. "Who were those guys who stood up?" Solomon glanced back. The 6 SEALs were outside now, too, gathered near the exit, talking quietly. They weren't looking for attention, just keeping order, like they always did. "These are the men I bled with. The men who know loyalty," Solomon said. "The men who never forget." Tyrone nodded slowly. It was powerful. "It was necessary," Solomon said. "Sometimes silence is louder than a cry, and sometimes silent fortitude speaks more than 1,000 words." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Tyrone smiled. "Are you going to tell me those war stories now?" Solomon chuckled. "Some of them. You're old enough for the real details." They stood shoulder to shoulder, more than just father and son. 2 men bonded by something inexplicable. Christy just lived nearby. Creed raised his hand, not in greeting, but in respect. Tyrone returned it without hesitation. The sun continued to rise, but time seemed different for the Dritton men now. But there was still one more moment, because after all this, the real lesson had yet to be spoken. Most of the crowd had dispersed by the time Solomon and Tyrone made their way back to the parking lot. A few families still lingered, laughing around, folding chairs or loading trunks with flower arrangements and graduation gifts. But the bustle had died down, and the sun had softened into the early evening light. Solomon opened the Charger, the same car his wife used to drive to PTA meetings and weekend getaways. Tyrone paused at the passenger door, running his fingers over a scratch near the handle. "She would have screamed the loudest today," he said quietly. "She would have made you retake every picture until your smile was perfect." Solomon responded, managing a grin. They got into the car, closing the doors behind them. The car was warm from the sun, but it felt like a cocoon, sealed off from the rest of the world for a few moments. Tyrone turned to his father. "I have to ask, why didn't you say anything to those guards? You just sat there." Solomon tapped the steering wheel once, then turned to him. "Because I don't have to defend who I am, and I don't have to raise my voice to be heard." Tyrone looked out the window for a moment, considering what he had said. "Do you know how many times in my life I've had to choose between letting something go or making a big deal out of it?" Solomon continued. "That moment today, what those people were trying to do, it wasn't new. But how we respond, that's what defines us." "But they disrespected you," Tyrone said in front of everyone. "Yeah," Solomon said, "and everyone saw that. But they also saw the truth. They saw 6 people who had every reason to be somewhere else standing up. Not because I asked them to, but because they knew what that moment meant." Tyrone considered what he had said. Son, Solomon said, life will give you 100 chances to respond with anger. And sometimes anger is justified, but more often than not, silence cuts deeper. Dignity lasts longer. That's what people remember. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph, one of Tyrone as a baby, his late wife holding him. I carried that with me through Kandahar. I carried that with me through the loss of your mother, and I carried that with me today. Not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me of what's worth protecting. Tyrone's voice dropped. You always knew who had your back. Solomon smiled. I didn't need to know. I just had faith. Real men don't disappear when things get uncomfortable. They show up and stand their ground. There was a pause before Tyrone spoke again. I want to be like that. Like you. You already are. Solomon said, you walked across that stage with pride. You didn't let anger steal your moment. You stayed grounded, even when everything around you tried to bring you down. Outside the car, the last of the SEALs were climbing into their vehicles. Creed took one last look at the Charger before driving away. Solomon nodded once. No words, just a quiet acknowledgement of something that had never changed. Tyrone sat back in his seat. What now? Solomon turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled. We're going home now. You pick out dinner. Tyrone grinned. Waffle House. Solomon grinned. Sure. As they pulled out of the parking lot, high school was behind them. But the memory of what happened in that gym would soon linger for anyone who was there. And for Tyrone, this day marked much more than a diploma. It was the day he realized that courage has nothing to do with noise, and everything to do with how you act when the world stops watching. Some scream to be noticed. Others just sit in silence and are never forgotten. If this story touched you, be sure to subscribe. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of what real strength looks like.